The International Criminal Court has decided to put out a warrant against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. We've already talked about this. And Mohammed Day, if I should mention, to be fair to all sides, they also put out a warrant on a dead guy. So that makes them not anti-Semitic. Uh, but many nations, or a few nations, were a bit unsure about what to think about that warrant. I think for some time, for example, UK has struggled about should they pursue it, but David Lammy has came out and pretty much said, yeah, we will, if Netanyahu comes here, we will arrest him. Now, France has somewhat surprisingly, and we'll talk about that, come out saying that they think basically that Netanyahu cannot be prosecuted. We'll talk about the reasons for it, but basically they said, we acknowledge ICC, but we will not abide by it. Joining me today after some time is the great Mark Pellegrino. I usually have like an old movie reference that I mentioned him from, but I didn't think of one today. But Mark, how have you been?
Hanging in there, man. Just trying to keep my head above water in this crazy, crazy world we're living in today.
So, what do you think about this somewhat surprising message from France, basically saying they will not arrest Netanyahu if he comes in?
Well, I got the sense from the article that they were trying to hedge their bets. I got the sense they were talking out of both sides of their mouth. They were saying we acknowledge the ICC's jurisdiction over member states, but not necessarily over states that are not members of the ICC, and that there is a certain immunity, but that the courts will have to decide whether or not they arrest Netanyahu. The foreign minister was not willing to come straight out and say France will not abide by this verdict. So I got the sense that it's a good sign, of course, that France is checking their premises, but not a fully good sign because the politician is too afraid to come right out and say that this is an illegal and immoral verdict and France will not stand by it. He's quote unquote leaving it up to the courts. The perfect politician's response to an issue like this.
Yeah, so we've had, I believe, someone like Hungary basically also coming out. They did it, I think, the day off when the warrants were released, basically saying we will not abide by it, which again sort of shows an interesting thing when it comes to ICC. Basically, if nobody abides by it, it really does have no power, which I think is really good to have. And also this. While I think with France, as you said, I think they're more of a like a hedging their bets sort of. But I think a nation like I know Czechia came out saying I think the Prime Minister Petr Fiala pretty much said this was like a terrible thing coming out of the ICC. But I'm not sure if they've committed to upholding it because they are also sort of, it's sort of like a standard. Most of the Western nations do have respect for international law, the international organizations. Basically, they see it as, this is helping the human rights cause. This is helping prosecute bad guys. This, or at least this what it was founded on, or supposedly founded on. And many nations are now realizing, wait, why is it always Israel? Why is it always the democratic nations that are attacked by international law? Why is it always these type of things that are always targeted? I mean, you mentioned you had to watch the Francesca Albanese interview, and we'll talk about that on the reality show. And she used that argument. She said Israel has broken the most international law among all countries. You have like actual dictatorships, actual totalitarian states, in many cases even occupying, not even mentioning they are occupying their own people by not recognizing their individual rights, but even if you want to make a case about like other people, Russia is in Ukraine, China is doing, we don't even know how much to the Uyghurs, Turkey is doing to the Kurds. I mean, you could go on and on. And Israel is the one who is doing the most? Mark, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's absurd, and it's the kind of circular logic that these Palestinian, pro-Palestinian folks love to engage in, which is they have a relatively bigoted community that already has a great deal of prejudice against Israel, signing off on resolution after resolution after resolution condemning Israel, and then they use that as proof that Israel is bad. It's a circular form of logic. It doesn't depend on any objective morality at all. In fact, it depends on your second-handedness as a human being that you would hold consensus as a valid form of truth as opposed to actual objective reality. And they fall back on that all the time. I think even in the interview with what's her face from the UN, she relied on consensus all the time with respect to definitions about genocide. It was consensus. And morality isn't a matter of consensus. Morality is a matter of objective facts in relationship to human life and human values. It's not up to vote. It's not a matter of the number of people that agree or disagree with you. And so I find it a particularly obnoxious form of justification for their cause.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the idea of consensus, and in this way, you could even think that a pretty bad organization such as League of Nations was even better at this because at least even they had some principles they could kick you out or they could actually do some when a nation went rogue, they did something. But with the UN, it's almost on principle, no one is ever kicked out. Well, there were talks about suspending Israeli membership, so I should be careful about that. But there was never real talk about, hey, maybe some nations are so bad they don't even deserve to be in this organization. If the purpose of the organization is to promote, let's say, I mean, they'll never use the term individual rights, but even the diluted concept of human rights. If the purpose is this, maybe we should have some standard for nations. But as you said, what does consensus mean? It
Yes,
means,
but under their standard of human rights, I mean, I think from Article 27 on, it's basically a socialist platform of rights violations. So in effect, their concept of human rights embodies the very authoritarian states that they use to attack Israel.
yeah, and so just sort of going back to what France has said. So they have said a state cannot be held to act in a way that is incompatible with its obligation in terms of international law with regards to immunities granted to the states which are not party to the ICC. And as you said, on the other hand, they said France is very committed to international justice and will apply international law based on its obligation to cooperate with the ICC. And sort of the legal argument, which I don't even like to consider international law as any law in its sense, but sort of the legal sort of argument is that because Israel is not the signatory to the ICC, you cannot prosecute Netanyahu. And I think now it really depends about if you want ICC to sort of have any legitimacy at all, which I don't think it does. But if you start making that argument, you can also not go after Putin because Russia is not ICC signatory either. China is not ICC signatory. Turkey is not. You cannot go after almost any people because as soon as there is a potential which I think was the original reason, although I'm not 100% sure, but I think one of the reasons why America has left the Rome Statute is because ICC was considering going after George W. Bush.
Yeah. Yeah, and the pro-Palestinian people make that point all the time that they should go after George Bush. They should go after Biden because George Bush promoted the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and under his leadership, 2 million Iraqis were killed in that conflict, and Biden is overseeing the quote unquote genocide in Gaza. So everybody in the Biden administration should be prosecuted under international law. So yeah, it's certainly used. It's used as a tool against free states for sure. Um, and yeah, and I think it has zero legitimacy at all. I don't think there should be anything. I question the legitimacy of international law, period. I think that it has no real enforcement mechanism, and 124 countries that don't share the same governing premises or economic premises cannot possibly be on the same page with respect to a court of law to adjudicate their differences. So it's sort of a farce in the first place. There should be laws between nation states, governing the way they deal with each other and treaties between them, but no international governing body that sort of oversees the concept of enforcement of rights. Because as we can see, they don't really know what that means, and they're using it for political ends.
Yeah, and as I've always said, I've never, or at least on principle, I'm not opposed to international organizations. I think if you can come up with something like, I mean, NATO would be the most perfect example. There is, and even NATO has problems because, again, I think if you have an international organization, it has to be as discriminatory as possible. It has to have some standards of entry. It cannot allow anyone to come in because even with something, let's say like the International Criminal Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, it sort of relies upon, as I've always said, if you are a proper nation, if you are a Western liberal democracy, when, under what we would want to be as objective law, if something bad happens, if you're, let's say you're talking about war, if there is something that goes wrong with the army, there are already processes in Israel, in the American army to account for that, to make sure, you don't have like a general going rogue or, you don't have these like, yes, something bad happening. It's the dictatorships that don't have any sort of standards. And again, there is this sort of misuse. It's only the good nations who would ever sort of like actually have some ways to sort of regulate themselves. So it is done properly. It is not going rogue. It's those rogue nations that don't care. So it's this sort of, on principle, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice can go only after liberal democracies because they're the only ones who actually have any sort of any willingness to actually be better.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, the international communities that don't share the same premises are going to come in conflict with one another constantly, and the side that's going to have to compromise is the good side to the bad side, as we see constantly in the UN. Just reaffirming what Rand said, that any good compromising with evil is a victory for the evil. And so this is always going to be the case unless you have a union of states that share the same basic premises with respect to what states are, what rights are, what it means to violate rights, and what self-defense means for a nation. I mean, the stuff that I hear on the debate that we're going to talk about later on, was absurd with respect to the shackles that they want to put on Israel. And there's a lot of people that agree with that. So that's frightening. Yeah. So share the same premises, or don't form a union.
We have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. He says, "Great to see Mark, one of the best defenders online. Definitely." We have a super chat from Bull Moose. Thank you so much. He says, Macron originally said he'd comply with the ruling. Then Bibi told him if he'd abide by it, he wouldn't let France involved in the negotiations with Lebanon. I think that's the reason he retracted. So I'm not sure. I'd be surprised if Macron committed to anything so soon after the warrant happened. I haven't. I saw them from the start, sort of like trying to wiggle out, not really deciding either way. But I've seen some people saying that now with the Lebanon ceasefire basically going through, that maybe there was a sort of like a secret agreement or sort of just a some negotiation basically saying, hey, if you go by this, we will support you in a sense, we will defend you, or we won't go after you. I mean, that's a thing that's out there. I don't think it matters either way, but what do you think, Mark?
Well, I mean, I've heard the same thing too, and it's very possible that France wanted the prestige boost from being a participant in this ceasefire deal. I mean, it's a big deal for Europe and America to get a ceasefire between Israel and the warring factions right now. I think it's absurd. I think it's insane. I think it's insane for Israel to agree to the ceasefire. Uh, Perhaps it'll be in their interest to withdraw from that front for a while so that they could relieve their military of some personnel so they can go home and become productive members of society for a time and lift up the economy of Israel. But as far as I'm concerned, stopping beating these jihadis to a pulp until they say surrender is a very bad idea in the long run.
Yeah, so going into basically just a few hours before, there was a report that, or sort of news that Netanyahu basically had until midnight today, I think Israeli time, so just in a few hours, to basically notify ICC if he wants to appeal. And so the experts were saying, he should appeal to the court basically because he has a case that this decision to go after him is flawed, while many of others, especially his political allies, were saying no, just ignore it and possibly wait for the U.S. To sanction the court because there have been I think since definitely since the warrant came out, but I think even if you go back months when the first time, I think in April, when the first time they started talking about the warrants, Republicans were already talking about sanctioning the ICC. So I think especially with Trump coming into office, we'll very likely see some sanctions on the court. And just to update on this, Netanyahu has decided to notify the ICC court that he will try to appeal this arrest. What do you think, Mark?
I'm not happy with that, to be honest with you, because I think the appeal itself acknowledges the legitimacy of the court, and it has no legitimacy. I think he should wait for Trump to come into office. I think the threat of economic sanctions against the 124 countries that are a part of the ICC can be a very, very powerful tool. Of course, it'll be used by the other side to pretend like there's no such thing as justice and that the rich corporations and rich companies and those Jews, those pesky Jews, they're pulling the strings everywhere and they're evading justice because they have the economic power. Well, nonsense. So I think it's a bad idea for Bibi to acknowledge the legitimacy of the court by appealing it. I think he should ignore it and continue doing what he's doing. I think, of course, he should do more than he's doing right now. I think he's draining the human and economic resources of Israel by dragging this war out longer than it has to be in order to impress the international community in a way that they're not ever going to be impressed. I think it's a lost cause, and he should give it up, fight the war to defend the Israeli people, end it quickly, and of course, it's now been over a year, so it can't be over quickly, but end it as quickly as possible and get on with life. Either taking over those territories by a military occupation and reforming the people until they can have an independent state of their own, or just annexing it outright and having those territories become part of Israel and let the populations go to the 22 other Arab states where they have a similar culture and religion and are perfectly fine within.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just to maybe clarify, because you mentioned sanctions on all 220 countries. I don't think that's what's
It was
being talked.
124.
No, I mean, because that's like all of the Western world basically being sanctioned. I think they are talking about specifically the ICC, meaning like the people working directly for ICC or the courts themselves would basically like the people wouldn't be able to, let's say, open a bank account
Okay.
in America and something like that. Well, because I think sanctioning pretty much the whole world
I mean,
would be quite,
Trump's essentially going to do that anyway with his
yeah,
tariffs.
well,
So,
fair
so I
enough.
feel like it loses its threat strength when he's already planning on putting 25% tariffs on every country that competes with us.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be. We'll definitely have to talk about that because I think he did announce 25% on both Canada and Mexico,
That's
which
stupid.
Yeah, it's kind of it's also like really interesting because he was originally behind the second part of like the free trade deal between Canada and Mexico. It's sort of weird, like him sort of going back on that. But that's for that's for some other time.
Weird. He's a pragmatist. He doesn't have economic principles. He sticks his finger up in the air and he probably follows his instincts, what he feels might be the best solution, and then goes that way, and probably follows it until he sees it doesn't work, and then tries something else.
Yeah, so even when it comes to these specific sanctions against the ICC, I think they were spearheaded mainly by one, and now I don't know the specific title. Basically, like he will be the Senate Majority Leader once the new the new Senate sort of like starts, but he's not yet. So the upcoming Senate Majority Leader has been speaking out. Against ICC. I'm not sure if we've heard much from Trump, so he might not even be involved that much directly because that might be just a legislative thing. Uh, so yeah, I mean, sort of just coming back to the whole topic. I mean, yeah, as you said, Netanyahu sort of like trying to appeal it. While I can understand, sort of on the pragmatic grounds, I mean that's the reason why they went to the ICJ. And if you go to the reality show where we talk about Francesca Albanese, that's what she was saying. If you're not guilty, just show up, and your innocence. You can prove your innocence. But again,
That's Soviet style. It's like Soviet style circular reasoning to get somebody into the purge court. If you really don't have anything to hide from Stalin, come on in. It's just so frighteningly it's bizarre and transparent. I don't understand why more people don't see through it.
yeah, and I think the reason why they're going it is the similar reason why they went to the ICJ. Basically, they know they are not committing genocide, and if reality is the standard, if the court are going by the by the objective standards, then they can easily prove, or rather, you don't have to prove you're not committing a genocide, or well, technically in the ICJ you kind of do, but basically, you shouldn't have to prove that you're not committing a genocide. The other side that takes you to the court has to prove you are committing something, and which was also really funny to see because I think the most recent episode we did on the ICJ was about the fact that South Africa hasn't submitted any proof that Israel has been committing genocide. But yeah, that's why I don't understand why they're trying again. I mean, you might say this is a different court. This is not ICJ. This is ICC. But again, it's a similar thing. You can only prove your innocence in where reality and objective law is the standard. When you have something like ICC and ICJ, yeah, I mean, how can you prove your innocence? I always go to the for those who remember the trial from Atlas Shrugged. It's like I don't even have to be here. There's no way I can prove my innocence where objective law is not the standard.
Right. And the only justification I can imagine for Bibi Netanyahu to go in there is just to put his statement on the record, on the written record, so that there is, by probably the ICC standard, some form of objective evidence. And, right, if they take testimonials as objective evidence, then they'll have loads of it from Bibi. So maybe he just wants to make it official. I don't know. I think it's absurd. I don't think you should acknowledge the absurdity.
Yeah, so sort of just wrapping up, it looks like France sort of stands behind Israel. It might be just because of the Lebanon deal. We'll see where this will continue because again, this is technically, the warrant against Netanyahu is there, so now he pretty much cannot travel anywhere besides the US. But if we look back a year or so about when it comes to sort of how much of a support Israel, the moral support Israel has gotten from the West, I mean, America is probably the only one place to go, and even that's on the fence in some places. but we'll continue talking about this, meaning Israel, on the reality show, where we'll be going through the interview on Piers Morgan with Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur for the, I believe, occupied Palestinian territories, which is going to be interesting. Mark, anything to say before we go?
No, no, nothing to say at all.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you on the reality show in just about a minute or so. Bye bye.